Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. I am starting us off today, and I am Barney, and I'm joined here today with my co-host, and he is.
I am Jacob.
And I'm glad that I can say that I'm back this week. One thing led to another, and schedules and whatnot, and I wasn't able to join in last week's episode with Matt, but I hope that you all agree that with myself that it was a really interesting episode and fun to see visually, interesting to see visually, and made me think a lot about myself when I was doodling. And I have some thoughts that maybe we can unpack about that in a future episode. But today, I'm thinking that maybe we'll kind of touch back a little bit on last year's one topic that we had last year, maybe to get us started when we talked with Jen Klingbaum, and she had an art installation. And I'm going to start us off with a question, and that was that I know that her art installation was at an Ohio Conference meeting.
Yes, it's the same one that we're talking about
The
today.
same one. Oh,
yes.
Good, great. Because I was going to ask, because I think that I don't know if there's a few different ones or whatnot, because I know that I remember my dad would often be a delegate or a representative or just out of his own interest would go to some of the different Ohio Conference meetings. And I'm not sure if it was the annual assembly, which we'll talk about today, or if it was another one that happened throughout the year. But today, Jacob and I would like to talk a little bit about the Ohio Mennonite Conference Annual Assembly, which just took place earlier in the month of, was it March or was it at the end of February?
Oh, March, just this past
just
a week ago today.
Very start of March.
Yeah, the very start of March.
You can't get any more March than this one was. And as we'll get to here, there are a lot of things that are taking place transition wise and whatnot, and very important topics that were brought up that are very, very relevant for all of us in a number of different walks of faith and whatnot, that I think would be really interesting to hear about today. So we'll just I guess get started by asking Jacob to tell us a little bit about how the conference went and what are some of the main things that happened. And we'll learn more as we go along.
Thank you so much, Barney. I really appreciate that. It's interesting. I've been going to these conferences since I started in 2010 in the pastor role at Worcester Mennonite. And so this is my 14th visit to this annual conference. And, in the life of an organization, you do have these large gatherings where everybody comes together for connecting and networking, and also to put our heads together for big picture discussions of problems or potential opportunities. And so this year was the same. We were looking at our church structure, our conference structure, in a time when we are a little smaller than we have been in the past. So we're trying to find a structure that's nimble and serves us well and works with the amount of volunteers that we have. And we also were looking at our constitution and trying to be more vibrant and capable of responding to the needs around us in this season. And so that was a main focus of the conference. And so I'm really excited to talk about it, and also about our guest speaker, Megan Larissa Good, who is an author and a lecturer and also a pastor within the broader Mennonite church, but she serves at a different conference, but she was willing to come and spend time with us. So I have a lot of pictures that I want to share with you. I have notes from the talks that Megan gave. But basically, those are the broad brushstrokes. So is there anything else that you would like to mention or ask or add before I jump into some pictures?
Yeah, when we were talking about this as a possible topic before we started recording, then yeah, the first question that came to mind was, were there any art installations?
Oh, nice. Well, that is, I'm trying to remember. there was not to my memory, a
Mhm.
prominent one as there had been the
Right.
previous year,
Mm.
but there were stations set up at different places. One of them had beautiful bowls, and
Mm.
the intent of that station was for people to write notes to some of the Ohio Conference staff who were retiring. And so
Oh.
each bowl was a different color, and they were very bright and prominent. And so that in and of itself was a visual. But I don't feel like there was that larger visual like last year of the door that we had, that Jen had made. So that was a difference. Yes.
Mhm.
Now it's funny because I'll say this now and then. If any of my colleagues hear it, they may come back and be like, Jacob, didn't you remember XYZ? But so I stand to be corrected. But as far as my memory goes for now, there were not any installations like
Right
last time.
on.
Yeah. But I do have some art to share with you, that was all part of the church that was hosting the conference. And so
Right.
maybe I'll pull that up right now.
Yeah.
And the host congregation was Sharon Mennonite Church in Plain City. And as you came down the stairs and heading towards the main room where our events were, you would see these two items that I have pictured on this slide. On the right part of the slide, there was a quilt of three crosses, which is
Yeah.
quite beautiful. And then on the left is a historical display case where they had all types of photographs and handwritten correspondence and objects from the history of the congregation. And I thought it was so interesting, and it made me feel like perhaps we should try to do something like that at Worcester Mennonite, because as you
Mm.
walk closer and you look, you just get a sense of the place and the community as it was in the past. And some of the written correspondence there talked about some pressing issues of the day. I think there were some things in there about um, voluntary service as opposed to conscription in the military during a time of a draft, and the peace position of the church during that time when there was a draft, and how people were pursuing voluntary service options. And so some things related to deeply connected aspects of the Mennonite culture and convictions of the tradition. And then, some other things like there's a quilt in there and some things that were made by congregation members. So, anyway, we did see art, even if it
Right.
wasn't directly related
Yes.
to the conference, but more just to the local church there. But it was neat to get a flavor for that. So,
And this photo, these two photos, you edited them. This slide, you prepared it very well. I actually thought that the quilt was right next to the display case.
oh,
So
yes. Well, it's interesting because the quilt is beside the display cases, but I couldn't fit them in the width of the slide
ah,
and in their original perspective. I had to kind of cut off the edges to fit them together, to get a close enough view that you could discern what they are. But yes, they are both in the same room and they're beside each other. But in this slide, it just bumps them even closer. Yeah. So,
yeah,
but thank you.
yeah,
So yeah, so it's interesting. For those who are following along on the YouTube video, you'll see here as we go through this presentation that you can get a sense of the space. This
right,
was the large auditorium where we met, basically like a gym that
right.
the church has connected to it. And this is a picture of the delegate assembly. And so you could see people from around 40 different congregations. Many churches had 2 to 3 people representing them. So, with that math in mind, you could think of maybe potentially 100 to 120 people, just a range of a good sized group. And then, in addition to that, we had conference staff. And it was a very, I think, a healthy, participatory group. And I felt like there was a lot of positive energy, and um, people were there to connect and discuss and engage. And so this is the opening part, when the delegate assembly was first convening. And soon after that opening, our guest speaker, Megan Good, stood up for her talk on the church in a time of decline. And so I thought you might find this interesting, Barney, because I think you appreciate statistics.
Yeah,
And this is a real quick snapshot that she pulled from the Gallup poll. And it is a percentage of Americans who belong to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. And in 1999, that involved 70% of
Yeah.
Americans. By 2010, it was 62%. And by 2020, it's 47%. So you can see a drastic reduction in the amount of people within the United States participating in um, these three main expressions of organized religion. There are other, you know, other
Right.
statistics that could have been included, other religious traditions, but just taking those three, you
Right.
can see a trend. And so, if as we think about this kind of declining religious affiliation, just by thinking of the Gallup poll, Megan kind of walked us through some possible reasons for that, and it was so fascinating to hear her perspective. She thought that tech shifts had an impact. As our technology has advanced, it has fostered greater distraction for us as human beings, and which does impact faith and our sense of how we want to use our discretionary free time. Uh, she also talked a bit about scientific materialism. An increase of the dominance of science can sometimes make faith seem less plausible. And that's interesting because it's not necessarily something that just is within the past 20 years that that's the case,
Right.
but I guess she's saying that's kind of a general factor in the conversation in general. Um, and then she highlighted kind of our individualism, this emphasis on our autonomy and the suspicion that we have sometimes towards external authorities like religious institutions. And she also mentioned pluralism, how we have this greater exposure to diverse worldviews, and it might weaken allegiances to specific religions just by hearing many different perspectives of what could be or how we could understand reality. And then finally, and this one is a very real one and a hard one to think of, but is a good point to make, and it's true, is about the abuse scandals, how church related scandals involving authority figures, inconsistency, the misuse of power, all of those things have damaged trust and commitment. And so I thought that was kind of fascinating that she took that time to walk us through, um, to kind of say, oh, not just we see decline, but what might have led us to this place. And then she had a really good connecting point in what she was saying to have some historical context for this. She said that this is not the first time the church has faced a crisis like this. And so she referenced the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And she said it was a similar crisis of authority where individuals were trying to go back to the source, the Bible, to address abuse and a pre-deviation from like core values. And so she was talking about, the sale of indulgences at that time and how that was also undermined trust and commitment to church authority. And um, she also highlighted tech shifts. There was a huge tech shift happening at the time of the Reformation as people grappled with the impact of the invention of the printing press, which made the text of the Bible more available to people, which made the dissemination of information and lots of different perspectives on religious issues available, even from dissenting voices, those who were critical of the Catholic tradition or other traditions. And so that was its own tech shift happening at that time. And so her point is, okay, if we're going to navigate this time of decline in contemporary Christianity, we need to see what course corrections are needed for the church in our current moment of uncertainty, because there's also potential for transformation in this moment, just like there was during the time of the Reformation. Maybe there'll be some new expression or clarity or convergence. And she's pointing to the hope of, if we have a healthy response, maybe we can recover a more healthy expression of faith and a Jesus-centered approach to Christianity. So that was where she took us the rest of the weekend. What could this response be? What could it look like? And I would love to talk with you about some of those pieces if I can, but I'm going to stop here for a second and stop sharing my screen and give you a chance to respond. Did any of those ideas jump out to you, or did you have any questions about any of those parts?
Yeah, when I saw the information from 70% all the way down to 47%. And then, especially from 99 to 2010 was just 8% drop. And then, but from 2010 to 2020 was 15% drop. And yeah, I think the first thing that you kind of go to is why or what or how or what was going on, or what were the various things that could lead to that, because it's just such a big number. And it's not consistent with what we had seen, and it's a much steeper decline than, she listed the kind of demographics, I guess there was Gen X and um, millennials, also that she listed by percentages there. And I remember seeing that um, just a quick survey, I think, in a British newspaper, maybe the Guardian or something like that, and um, people were saying, listing, they were talking to, you know, uh, people in their late teens and 20s, and what are some things that you think are old fashioned, and of course one of them was going to church. And you think, why or how does it get this label of being old fashioned? And then how exactly, like she brought up, how do you course correct? How do you, I mean, not necessarily combat that label, but help people to see church is something different from being old fashioned. Um, and yeah, and if you can find why, what causes this decline or this thinking, then it gives you a place to start off to how to work with that, and to think of how to change how people are seeing church, and helping them to find a way that they can feel part, um, a way to belong, or that church is necessary for them. But then exactly within this, all of these changes in technology too, especially within those last 10 years. If I think about how the technology I was using 10 years ago, and then now it seems like a short time, but boy, a lot has really changed. And it's very necessary. I would think that she listed that as one of the reasons for that attributes to the decline, because yeah, you can see how there's a lot of things that are um combating, or competing for our attention, and then even being able to take part of church, or take part in church online and through YouTube and whatnot. And I wonder if I personally very much enjoy that, and I throughout the week I have the chance to listen to two or three different messages from different churches. But I wonder if someone who is just taking church that way, maybe not even consistently, if they would feel enough to say that they belong to that church, um, or if they're going to church, and so maybe there's half a percentage of people who engage in church, but wouldn't necessarily quite feel like they could say, I'm going to church. Because yeah, church is more than just hearing the message. Church is being with the family, the body of believers too. And so maybe that's understandable why they would think that maybe if that is one of the given reasons.
Barney, I think you bring up a lot of great points. Yes. And it's interesting how the data stops at 2020, because with the pandemic, the measurements, participation, everything are going to be greatly impacted. And so was that poll taken before the pandemic started in
Right.
2020, or was it
Right.
during the
After.
pandemic, or yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Or
Um,
during, yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. And yes, if you took that same poll in 2024, where would we be
Yeah.
now? Like you said, and
Mm-hmm.
the diffusion of the data too, like into this new category of participation of an online participant. And what does that mean? Well, I don't go to a physical building, like a church or a mosque or a, a synagogue, but a person could say, but I might see a service online. And
Right.
is
Right.
that is that still connection to an institutional religion? I mean, sort of, yeah. I mean, I mean, particularly if something prevents them from um,
Oh yeah.
it, it, physically going, or it's hard for them if they work on a Sunday, or um, also, like, sometimes people will participate remotely and they still have some level of connection with the what the community is doing. Sometimes they will give financially, or
Mhm,
you know
mhm,
other things. So yeah, I love that you bring that up. That's very good,
mhm,
for sure.
mhm, mhm.
Well, maybe just for a bit, we could pause a little bit the Megan's um, conversation in terms of the bigger discussion of church and time of decline and how we respond, and zoom in a little bit to her words that were a little bit more pastoral or meant to comfort,
Mm.
like us in Ohio Conference. And I want to focus on a sermon that she gave, and this was on Friday night. And I have a picture here from that service. And during this time, she was talking about the idea of intimacy or closeness with Jesus, and um, using the phrase being in Christ or living life in Christ. And she said when she was um, preparing for the conference, she prayed and asked God, what are some words that you would have for me to share with all of the participants at Ohio Conference when I'm with them? Like, what message would you want to give the conference that I could convey to them? And I really loved what she had to say.
Mhm.
I'm just looking at my notes that I took during this sermon that she gave, and one of the things that she said is that it's okay to change. That was like her first message. Like, God was speaking. She felt like, and it was the perfect thing to hear on this weekend, because we were very much in a process of change. We had these long standing staff who were retiring. We have the new um, big structural changes, and trying to work at how we can do ministry more efficiently. And just to have kind of the sense of God's breathing life into that and saying it's okay. The fact that you've gotten smaller, to get out of this mindset of decline, and more in a mindset of like, what is the season I'm in, and what does God have for me in this season? And so she quoted this passage from John 15:1-2, and just said, it's okay to change. I don't have the passage right now to
Right.
read, but that's the reference she quoted. And then the second thing, and this was even the stronger one, she said, in changing, it doesn't necessarily mean, like, decline or change doesn't necessarily mean an ending. Um, but even if it would be, and if some churches in Ohio Conference would, get smaller, and to a point where they would need to close, or the conference itself eventually at some point, if it, in the same fashion, were to get smaller. She said, she had this quote that she felt God was saying about, you can either die into the dust, where your end is kind of inert and it doesn't produce anything beyond that and it ends, or you can die into rich soil towards life. And that is a kind of type of change where new things can emerge, and new possibilities, new forms of ministry, new expressions of life.
Mm.
And so I thought that was so powerful, because, you know, and I think I might have said this, I don't know, when we talked about pastoring, and and the hope and vision that you have for your congregation, but people are, we're always seeking after, like, new life, and renewal, and new potential. And and when you get into conversations of decline and viability and things like this, it seems to, like, totally change that part of the discussion, and we stop thinking about renewal and newness, and we're starting to think about managing resources, and
Yeah.
and what
Yeah.
and these words that she was saying were that she felt were from God, about, like, live in such a way that no matter what your season is, even if you're in, quote unquote, like, organizational decline, or change in that way, like, there still is purpose, and it honors God, and there's potential for new things to spring forward, a new life. And so it's just a very hopeful message. So, um, and it makes me think like the life of faith itself is very much lived in this place of like, we don't know the future. We don't know what tomorrow brings, but we always want to try to have a posture of like living into the potential of what is good and can come out of our experiences. But years before this conference, Katie and I had gone to a retreat in Tiffin, Ohio. The Sisters of St. Francis have a spirituality center there. And they are a religious order that has been in decline for a number of years. And they have a lot of older sisters, and they're not getting newer sisters coming in and in significant numbers. And I remember one of the leaders there, Sister Paulette, was talking with us and just had this excitement in her service to Jesus, and an exuberance and a sense of life and vitality. And Katie and I were talking about it afterwards. It's like, she is not in a ministry in decline. she's she's in a ministry that is vibrant and doing the work of serving the Lord. And like, if it is ending, if you're viewing it that way from a certain point of view, they're doing it very well.
Yeah.
and they're doing it in a way that it is
Mm.
making potential for new life. So anyway, it kind of reframed this whole topic of decline for me, hearing her say that, and just being like, yes, let's be open to what God can do and bring and nurture within us in this season. So are there any thoughts you have? It's just as you're hearing that,
Yeah.
those words, Megan.
Yeah, it makes me think of how what a brave and bold thing it is to talk about that, because it I think that, especially in seeing our the slide before with the statistics, I think probably everyone or most people's first reaction is, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to solve this problem? I mean, even I probably alluded, was phrasing my responses and reflections just a few minutes ago in such a way. And then I think to later hear this message um where we're admitting what the problem is, and then also, making sure that everyone's aware that 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 um like, not trying to hide that, oh, we might be in trouble, or oh, there's, things are changing, or oh, things aren't working, or oh, it's not the same as it was. But then to see, trying to give comfort, and to effectively give comfort in that, by naming it and naming the what's happening, and but also phrasing it in a way that, it's doesn't, just because it seems like such a negative thing doesn't mean it's such a negative thing.
Mm.
And helping people to admit that it's okay to have a new outlook on what, is meaning for the church, and to reaffirm everyone's and to reaffirm and to remind everyone of, what faith is in the first place, and see instances where God was working for the best of the church, and that just things needed to change a little bit at that time. Um, I'm curious, how what were, because, to hear that is such like a breath of fresh air, right? To hear that put in the way that she put it, and how were some of the did you have the chance to, like, debrief or whatnot with some of the people around you, or um, just chat a little bit and reflect a little bit on what she said? And I'm curious about some of the other voices that maybe you heard responding to her sermon that Friday night.
I had a chance to debrief with one of my peers actually yesterday, Kevin Himes, who's pastor at Salem Mennonite Church, and
Hmm.
we were looking back on the weekend and we talked about that message that she
Oh,
gave.
yeah.
And
Mm,
I think that was helpful for both of us to hear,
mm,
because I didn't mention this, but at the start of the conference, we had a time of lament where we released two congregations who wanted to leave the conference for reasons of disagreement and realign in other places. One of them with Lancaster Mennonite Conference. Actually, it used to be called Lancaster Mennonite Conference. Now I think they just call it LMC because it's
Mm.
so much broader than just the geographic area of Lancaster in
Oh.
Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
But anyway, that my colleague Kevin was saying how that was such a hard way to start the conference
Mm.
because it plays right to that feeling of decline or struggle, and but I really appreciate that the churches that left took the time to come and be with us and to
Mm.
to to enter into the time to say goodbye and give us a chance to lament and say goodbye as well. That's ending well and in a lot of ways, just
Yeah.
taking the time to do that instead of just um, you know, cutting off relationship and then there's no further contact. So that was good. But then that was prior to Megan's word. And
Right.
um, so yes, change happens and it's hard and we are sad and miss people when they leave, miss congregations when they leave the broader network of churches, and miss the individuals from them that we became friends with. But we still try to live into this vision of um, of Christ's promise to be with us and to um, create the potential for life in the season we're in and to spring forth and to try to seek after that, even though it's hard to lose others and then also to respect their choices and let them walk the path that they feel called to, but then for those of us who feel called to remain, to be faithful in that too and not let the departure um, take us into a downward spiral of thought of just that decline mindset again, but more to stay
Mhm.
focused on the potential for life. So we talked about that. I did debrief also a little bit with um, Jim and Kim Hartman, a little bit more with Jim because I haven't seen Kim as much since we got back, but I ran into Jim for our men's group, and we were
Oh
talking
yeah.
after that about a little bit about the conference, and so I think he felt I think he appreciated Megan's words to us too, and we both were trying to say, well, how do we bring the good insight she had and this
Mhm.
word that's so important to hear um, to our congregation, Worcester
Right.
Mennonite? How do we? So that's going to be the next phase for us. But yes, to answer your question, I did debrief with a few people, and everybody I talked with so far has felt that the words were accurate and what we needed to hear and helpful. This is a picture of three individuals who are retiring from the conference who
Right.
um, are so uh, caring, and they've been such servants and servant leaders in the conference for many, many years. I think Judy King, who's on the right, I don't know if it was
Mhm.
27 years or it's
Wow.
close to 3 decades of service, and Ann Lehman in the center and Tony Dorman on the left. They all three of them have just served so faithfully the conference, and they're all retiring this year. And so this is truly a time of transition on many levels, and we
Yeah.
spent time honoring them. And I just want to say on this podcast, what a joy and a pleasure it's been to know these individuals and how they have truly been like a blessing to me personally and to many others in our local churches. Uh, so just wanted to share that. I don't know if
Mhm.
have you heard of any of these three? Have I ever mentioned them to you before?
Oh, I don't know that
Okay.
I have. Yeah.
Well, Judy, just as a point of reference that might connect with your experience a little bit, attends Orville Mennonite, where your mom's side of the family I know has a lot of connections. So it's possible that your mom and her family would have known Judy. I don't know how long she's been at
I'm.
Orville Mennonite, but
Yeah.
it's quite
When you
possible.
mentioned that, I just wondered if, not to take us down this road, if maybe we're related through my mom's
Okay.
cousin. So
Ah,
through
right.
through her husband. So it's very possible.
Okay. Okay. Very
Mhm.
cool. So
I agree.
um, So anyway, I just had to throw this slide in. This is the Hampton Inn where a lot of us stayed, which was close to the conference. It was very comfortable, and it was fun running into people in the hallways and at breakfast time. Just
Oh yeah.
those type of short conversations, like "How you doing? What do you think of the conference?"
Uh-huh.
Kind of fun little moments like that. So that was
And
pretty neat.
and it
Yeah,
and it gives it kind of a nice campus feel to it, where they, oh, hey, I saw you in class today.
that's right. It does do that. That's a really
Uh-huh.
good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is day two, and this is a graphic that Megan shared early in her presentation in the second day. And so, as we talked about how does the church respond in a time of decline, she moved the discussion now to like, what is Jesus-centered Christianity, and what could it look like, and how
Mm,
could it be a possible healthy response in light of the current situation we're in? For her,
mm.
she's convinced this is the best response,
Oh,
and I
okay.
can see why.
Well,
So
yeah.
she says um, she views Jesus centered Christianity as a movement of the Holy Spirit drawing Christians together despite various backgrounds, and emphasizing living their lives as though Jesus is Lord. I mean, they're taking that central conviction, Jesus is Lord, and they're trying to shape their lives around that and prioritize things around that. So that's her main assertion. And so she has in this graphic, it looks like a bullseye.
Right.
And in the center of the bullseye, she has this word kerugma, which is Greek for teaching, or it's like kind of the core proclamation
Mm,
that was at the center of the gospel. And she says that centerpiece of that kerugma is Jesus is Lord, that central conviction. And she wanted to talk a little bit about, if you're going to have Jesus centered Christianity, you have to understand why it's important to keep that as a centerpiece, to approach the Bible with that in mind, Jesus as a central lens, to remember in, in church life, to keep Jesus at the center of our relationships. Um, because she said, oftentimes without Jesus at the center, the church will grasp for power. And she talked a lot about power, which was so interesting. And she said that's
mm,
often where she gets most pushback from
mm,
her audiences, is when she talks about power. And it's that's very fascinating to me. So we might spend some time with that in a bit. But
mhm,
she says, without Jesus at the center, the church will often grasp for power and revert to a type of rigid legalism and a defending of boundaries of the church community, or lose the essence of post resurrection Christianity. And she shared this quote: until you have a notion of power that is not coercive, then you will fall
mm,
back on cycles of power and violence. So she spent a lot of time trying to outline for us this view that she thinks is a Jesus centered view of power, which is power from below. So power
mhm,
that is exercised on behalf of the interests of others, and for the good of the community. And so I thought that was very fascinating that she would take us to this place of looking inwardly and considering, um, how do we uh, treat others in our community, how do we value their interests, and then how do we also have a core sense of what unites us in our common belief, and we can stay focused on that and not be um, distracted by what she called disputable matters or less
mhm.
essential beliefs. And so um, you might be like, okay, well, what does she mean by disputable matters? Like, why? How does that relate to this bullseye image? So for those who aren't seeing the visual, at the external part of the bullseye, just at the very edge, um, that's where the disputable matters are. And she puts them out there, not at the center. And she's saying, oftentimes we get into trouble when we try to bring those into the center and make
Right.
them the core of what unites us, instead of it being this truth that Jesus is Lord. So she gives some examples, like we might say Jesus is Lord is at the center. The Jesus died for our sins is at the center. And
Mm,
then as you move outward from the bullseye, she might say something like, a secondary truth is you're not your own. Like we belong, our lives are really dedicated to Christ. And then the second tier out there is how we understand the atonement. It's important to know that Jesus died for sin, but there's a whole variety of languages and ways of explaining that. And she thinks it's important to keep it centered on Jesus died for sin. You don't always have to have just the right language, because a lot of Christian groups have got into major fights about how they um, talk about the sacrifice or the act that he's
Mm.
died for sin, but that not necessarily just staying
Um,
focused on the truth that he has. But then she has at the outer ring, the utmost exterior ring, church polity, like how we organize ourselves and structure ourselves, and
right.
method of baptism. These are examples of things that people will fight endless battles over sometimes, if you look back in church history, but it doesn't seem to bear a lot of fruit, and it causes quite a bit of
Mm.
division. And so partly Jesus-centered form of Christianity is about knowing like what the center of our belief system is, and it relates to how we use power, and it relates to how we navigate conflict and disagreement. Um, so she gave the example. And do you want me to stop for a moment and give you a chance to respond? Because I did
Okay.
not mean to go
Yeah.
on and on. I'll
Sure, sure,
stop here
sure.
for a minute and
Hmm.
please give you a chance to.
Yeah. When I especially saw the first slide, it's so great to see this one here with her examples to kind of give us some context or give us some examples of what she means by what would be the most important in the middle, and then things that might be disputable. But right when I saw that, some things that came to mind were I believe it's in Matthew 14, I think, like right when when he took the disciples to Caesarea, and he mentions that, uh, he uses the phrase that, the church on this rock I'll build the church, and the gates of hell won't stand up against it, essentially. And so when you get too focused on the disputable matters, and like you were saying about churches might tend to be legalistic or rigid and closing themselves off, that they are, instead of being offensive against the gates of hell, they're being more defensive against people challenging, outside influences, kind of trying to change or affect, this structure that they've built in their church that they're comfortable with. And but when we think about what we're all as Christians agreeing on is, Jesus's teachings, that Jesus is Lord, exactly. And if we focus on that, then we can remember that he told us to go out there and and pave the way. And when I also see this graphic designed as a bullseye, or concentric circles going inward, it makes me think of the Northern Exposure episode that we talked about I guess 2 years ago now, with when it was Christmas with Soulmates, and where Maurice is having he meets his family from Korea, and Chris and he talk about this and how things are so different and hard for him to understand. And Chris is pointing out that, the further you get away from the circle that's in the middle, the more things feel like the other, and they're so much harder to relate to.
Mm.
And but then Chris is saying that, that kind of thinking can be unlearned. And I think we can see a parallel, as in that kind of thinking of the things that are others, in this case, aren't so important, as we look at ourselves as being of the same culture of Christianity, and that what we're all tied together, we can all feel a sense of family about, is Jesus's teaching. And that if we, probably, as she probably mentioned a number of times, if we stay focused on that, then you know we can give up the fear that we feel about, um that, whatever it might be, but, probably, like you say, like losing power in a way, or
Mm.
what we might, someone in leadership feels like power is slipping away, and then, the fear sets in, and then, the rigidity comes in to try and keep a hold of this power however they can. But instead of trusting Jesus is Lord and the teachings. And but it's so easy. Even my my oldest son, who's almost 8, he and I were kind of talking about the same issue just a few hours ago. And it's something about being human that it's too easy to get distracted from the center, even though it should be the core of who we are as Christians. But it's just too easy to get distracted from that from time to time. And if we let ourselves get distracted long enough, then we start to focus, probably as she said, on the outside and
Yes.
forget to focus on the inside.
Wow, Barney, thank you. That's really insightful. I love that connection you made with the Northern exposure episode, and the further you get away from the center, the more other that it feels, or the interaction. And
Mm-hmm.
that's so true with this concept of identity. And if the identity is framed in terms of um, ex the non-essentials, then of course there's greater difference there than on what the common thing that unites us. And if your identity, your emphasis is on those things at the outer part of the rim, you will feel like a foreigner. You will feel estranged from the
Yeah.
others
Yeah. Right.
in your
Yeah.
midst, who are have different perspectives there. Yeah, she said a little bit about the Jerusalem Council
Yeah.
in Acts chapter 15,
Right.
how, the church was starting to experience this distance between the group within that were more connected to the traditions of the Jewish law, and maybe the more Pharisaical traditions, or the Judaizers, sometimes they're called, or those within the early church who wanted to keep practicing the law of Moses. And then those who were connected with what Paul and Barnabas were doing as they were ministering among Gentile communities. And they had to discern together as a council for new converts coming in. If they're Gentile, do they need to be circumcised? Which was such a core, essential aspect of the Mosaic law and of that tradition, that outward sign of covenant, which for the Judaizers, or that party within the church, it felt like a core essential thing. Um, but then they have to kind of discern this this bullseye and say, is it more, it has the centrality of Jesus's lordship and what he's offering in the new covenant, as it in a sense fulfilled um, the uh, the aspects of the old covenant that are still valued. They're still a part of the bullseye, but they have gone to a lesser position, to the point now where
Mm-hmm.
the church's identity is not solely grounded in those, but it's on the lordship of Jesus at the center. And so that council helps them move to the place where they can bring in the Gentiles without circumcision. So it's kind of an example within Scripture of this journey and this process of trying to truly have a Jesus-centered approach, and kind of coming to the core conviction that Jesus as the Lord, and Jesus's death for sin, and his work is the center of the message, and that these other things are important, but they're not of the same weight.
Mm-hmm.
Not every issue merits the identical weight, and some elements are central to the gospel, like we said, and are non-negotiable. We're not going to ever take out that piece that Jesus is Lord, or what He's done, that we can't. But other things are open for discussion, like we saw the church doing in Jerusalem. So yeah, so that's interesting how that commitment to follow Jesus in times of conflict, if we keep him at the center, it can maybe at its best foster dialogue and set
Right.
as it's centered around Jesus, like we see in the Jerusalem Council, and people can even find new ways to relate around Jesus, like the Jerusalem Council did, without creating divisions. They stayed united as a church.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, how do we recover that for today? Where we can have this kind of dialogue centered on Jesus and not create new divisions, but keep relating around him. And I think I'm so grateful that Ohio Conference has tried very hard to do that in our relationships. And as we've encountered some real struggles over the past few years, and different, um, I guess you would say, divisive issues within the broader Christian conversation, things about human sexuality or um, certain aspects of political understandings of what's going on in the broader sphere, or different things have come up, and it's like applying this image of the centrality of Jesus and letting it guide us through while still trying to be united in him. It's very inspiring to me, and I think I'm grateful. I feel like it connects with this journey in a lot of ways that Ohio Conference has been on. Um, so I do want to mention. Actually, I need to pause for a second and give you a chance to respond before I go to the next part. Is there anything that you would want to say before I would go to this next part?
Um, no, I think that it's really neat to hear how she her examples, her two examples so far of the Jerusalem Council and then also the Reformation. Um, we see a similar pattern, and you kind of wonder if right now, we're leading up to another big event, and another big stage, another big step for the church. I thought about how, with the Jerusalem Council, in that case, Peter was the eyewitness. He said the Holy Spirit came down upon these Gentiles, the same Holy Spirit that we had, and they were not circumcised. And so there's a real testimony, which helped people to bring their focus and attention right back to the middle of the bullseye. And hopefully, some churches or some groups or whatnot, hopefully we can get another one of those big moments that bring people's focus back to the center and away from, like some of the less important issues that you mentioned. And I like the way that you phrased it, that they're important in a way, but don't deserve the same weight as what we have in the middle. And also, like you said, they're open for for dialogue and discussion, and with Jesus as Lord and Jesus' teachings in the middle, then we can hear each other again instead of, putting the walls back up.
Thank you, Barney. Yes, that's a good point. Well, I wanted to just go to this scripture verse that she quoted, and I think she quoted it twice, but one time it appeared in her slides, and it is this one from Romans 12:3. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Instead, be reasonable, since God has measured out a portion of faith to each one of you. And it was just kind of a way of her saying, in this whole conversation, it's really helpful to have self-awareness and humility and recognize that that we have a seat at the table and that God has graciously included us, but we should also be aware of the other partners and the others sitting around the table too, and what God is doing in their lives, and to try to have this kind of spirit of conciliarity or working towards unity in the body with a mindset of building bridges and trying to have a Jesus-centered focus that can build up the body and not revert to more partisan spirit that was more about carving out chunks of the body to safeguard or dominate them or whatever. But I thought that was an interesting quote. The other thing that I wanted to mention, if I can, is that Megan spent a long time talking about practices that the church can engage in that are important for a Jesus-centered community. And she calls it a new kin network. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting way of framing how we talk about the family of God or the kingdom family or, Christ's body, a new kin network. And she said, she thinks there's certain things that we need to do to build a thriving and welcoming Christian community. And so the first is, and is it, there are quite a few of them. Do you care if I just walk through and then we'll pause different parts and get your thoughts? So the first one that she said is that a good news culture, that the good news of Christianity that we're proclaiming, that we're about, should address society's deepest wounds. And so if we're going to create a network of a family, a kingdom family, or I shouldn't say it that way. We're not creating it. God creates it. If we are going to enter into it,
Right.
and participate in, then we also should realize that the good news of Jesus is meant to address society's deepest wounds. And so we need to be aware of the the hurt and the pain of people around us, and realize that God and the Holy Spirit and Jesus have something to offer to bring healing to that and respond to that. Um, and then she also said, like, we really need to be a community of belonging. Like, we as Mennonites have historically really emphasized community,
Mhm.
but we don't always realize, like, for newcomers, maybe those who are new to church or are new to the Anabaptist tradition, coming from other church backgrounds, they might feel isolated sometimes when they come in our churches. And we need to remember to extend the circle of God's family and ensure that they feel welcome too. And so she gave some examples of like 606. Like, there's a certain
Mhm.
song that we sing, "Praise
Mhm.
God from whom," and it's a beautiful song with harmony and like lots of interplay between male and female voices and beautiful building chorus. But if somebody doesn't know that song and they come in, like, how can we invite them in, and when we have the things that we enjoy, it not be something that would make them feel like an outsider, those types of pieces. So it's just a fascinating point. We talked earlier, and you quickly said, not that we're going to go down this rabbit trail, but within the Mennonite context, a lot of people can trace their connections to other people in that same sphere by through their last names. They could say, "Oh, well, I know somebody who was a layman who lived here, and they went to this college at the same time my uncle did." And some people call that the name game, and it's a way of connecting for those who are
Right.
insiders. But for
Mhm.
outsiders who don't have a last name that fits into that paradigm, they can feel isolated. So it's just being aware of these pieces, right? But then she talked about, and if at a certain point, you'd like to bounce off of any of these ideas, just let me know. And
Okay.
she talked about bridging divides. We need to break out of the comfort zones we have to connect with outsiders, and remove the cultural barriers. We were just talking about some of those things that could be external things that we like, but we have to find ways that they don't become barriers to others,
Mm.
um, that make them feel isolated. And she said also to build trust and share power with newcomers who come into our community. If somebody joins a church, how long do we expect them to be a part of the community before they can lead a Sunday school class, or
Mhm.
be a part of a congregational discussion and vote or participate in um, shaping something? Like, how do we invite them into that and share that decision making with them? And she referred to that as sharing power, which I thought was interesting. And once again, earlier, the most pushback that she's gotten from her talks has been around this theme of power. But then she talked about something that I think surprised everyone. And Kevin Himes really, yesterday when we were talking about this, highlighted this idea of like a form of prophetic listening. And what she meant by that is um, like praying and listening to God and to a word that he might have for others, for other people we know. Almost like we think of that more in the terms of the charismatic tradition, God
Mm.
speaking, and then, sharing, a person sharing the word to the community. But she is saying, like, we need to kind of recover a sense as Anabaptists that God still speaks. And that's like what she was doing with her sermon earlier, that with and the message that she felt the Holy Spirit was saying to. And then, as we said before, this redefining of power, that to realize that power is often distributed disproportionately around us, and that we need to understand that Jesus redefined relationships with power, not in a coercive way, but in a sacrificial way, serving and protecting others. So, how does that press into the culture and the fabric of our local church community and into our conference? And so, um, we have to learn to accept not always getting our way, she said, when we prioritize the interests of others, even including those outside the church sometime, and even those we disagree with. Sometimes we have to hear their interests, and kind of connects back with what she said about realizing the needs in the world and the pain in the world.
Mm.
Uh, and also to develop a vision for enduring suffering well. Oh man, that's a tough one. But how does our comfort culture like shield us sometimes from entering into
Right.
this posture of acceptance, um, that sometimes can help us be more in touch with Jesus, and then lifting others up and seeing how to empower other individuals both inside and outside the church who are different from ourselves, and then um, trying to have a compelling alternative with that to what the world offers, instead of people finding empowerment through some things that sometimes are just self-serving, or
Right.
um, uh, can leave them feeling empty, that the church itself can offer a different way that would be fulfilling. And she did put out, and this is one final thing I'll say, that the people are apprehensive to make mistakes in the church, and we're often, some of these things are hard because we're afraid to, you talk about prophetic listening or redefining power. We're afraid to try new things, or to have a new approach. But she encouraged us, not to be afraid. And she gave this example of this book by Tanya Harris called 50 Days of God Conversations, and said that that could be a helpful resource as we try to work at some of these things, and we try to test our efforts with the character of Jesus. Like, this book helps us in that. So those are some of the main brushstrokes of her talk, and her focus on that second day. So do you have any responses or thoughts as we kind of walk through that?
Yeah, when I heard the list, it made me think back to um the slide with the statistics again. It sounds like so many of those are going toward changing the view that church is old fashioned. Um, if you engage a lot of those that she listed, it's almost like, and I mean, I know that it shouldn't necessarily be this way, but it's almost like those are the churches that are in the headlines, for good reasons these days, and it seems like it's kind of fewer and further between where you see churches that are, you know, willingly opening their doors to, homeless people and whatnot, and um, but um, it feels like with the a number of uh, elements in the list are in kind of linked with redefining and changing and kind of giving an even though it's kind of getting back to, again getting back to the reason why a church is a church and following the things that were that Jesus stressed so much in his teachings, especially about being servants, which again is one of the core things of one of the Anabaptist tradition, the Mennonite church. And um, you feel like maybe some of the drastic things that, or some of the noteworthy things, some of the things that need to happen that draw attention for people to put their phones down or to see that, hey, the church isn't old fashioned anymore, is to decide to make these, to work at starting to make these changes. It's not something that will just happen tomorrow, but it's a real process, but a worthwhile process. And again, sticking with the mindset that these things are gonna take time, but and many steps, but starting down the path and getting back on the right path again, remembering why we're going to church in the first place, not to see our friends, not because we feel that we should, but to learn about, what is the Bible telling us today? What's the message that we need for right now? And to be a part of the family and be a part of the body of Christ, of course. Um, and to remember that the church has the power to make changes outside of the church and that um, other institutions that we see in the secular world aren't doing or don't want to do or don't do enough of.
Mm.
And that's one of the ways I think to redefine, what our church is. And it's great that she pinpointed those and brought those up, and that again, like listening to other viewpoints, and being willing to give them a try. Maybe um, hopefully this message resonates as probably everyone who went to the conference is reporting back to their congregations coming up this weekend. Hopefully these messages stick with people and set in motion or continue the momentum that some churches have, and to keep working on this new shift that maybe we need to see happen with as times are really changing around us.
Yeah, I like how you frame that, Barney. And it's interesting. You picked up on something that I didn't mention to you independently of what I shared that Megan kept saying to the conference, and that you've talked about this idea of a shift, or are we on the precipice of maybe some large new adjustment or new
Mm.
reformation, so to speak. And Megan kept saying that throughout the conference. And I
Uh,
didn't mention that, but it's really neat
no.
that you independently of that information came to that same conclusion. She kept asking that question: are we on the cusp of some new period in church history when we'll shift in this way and have this posture? So that is really interesting, and I love that. Uh, so as you can tell, the time with Megan was really rich and
Mm.
meaningful. Um, and I think we're also grateful that she came. This is the second time she has spoken
Oh.
at our conference.
Mhm.
Several years ago, she spoke when we met in Bluffton University, and she was one of our speakers along with Marvin Lorenzana, who we've talked about him also on this podcast.
Mhm,
And at that
mhm,
time, the
mhm,
topic was more a focus on mission and how the church and the conference can be more missional. So,
mhm.
so we're hoping, and that was after she had written another book, and this time it was after she had written the book Divine Gravity. So we're hoping maybe every time she writes a new book, we'll just invite her after her new book, and it can become a
Right.
regular part of our rhythm and a fun and meaningful thing to do. But in addition to the visit from Megan, and that time we had with her, there was another conversation I had that I thought was so interesting that I wanted to share. And so I'm just going to pull up a picture right now. And this is of a professor from Bluffton University who my son Micah has in class this semester for religious communications. And this is Gerald Mast. And he came up to me. Micah told me to be looking out for him, and I was going to go search him
Mhm,
out at the Bluffton table. But during one of the sessions with Megan, during the microphone question response time at the end, I stood up to ask a question. And Gerald then saw me from that and then came to the table after the discussion
uh-huh.
because Micah had also told him the same thing. Hey, be looking out for
Ah,
my dad.
my dad.
And so we had this nice time to connect about my son Micah, and I really appreciate that Gerald has him in class and is a support to Micah and has been really a blessing to him. And then in addition to that, I was getting to know him. And then he said, but I'd like to speak to your question that you asked. And
Oh
it
no.
led to an hour and a half conversation. It was so rich and meaningful. And he was saying,
Mhm,
my question was about um, historically, Anabaptists have had this view of the church, which is sometimes called a pure body view of the church, which
mhm,
views its separateness from the world as its kind of defining characteristic. And this is sometimes contrasted with what Augustine and others might call a mixed body view of the church, which is that the church is made up of saints and sinners and always has this kind of dynamic in its corporate
mm,
life, that there are those who are, you know, are separate from the world and on this journey of faith, and then there are others who are not necessarily engaged in that way. And
mhm,
so that changes the dynamics. And so my question to Megan was, how do we navigate that tension as we're talking about these big picture questions of being a Jesus-centered movement, of this kind of desire for purity
Mm-hmm.
and faithfulness, and then also this sense like of including a larger group of people and of working towards unity
Right.
and
Right.
trying to figure that out, knowing it's complex. Um, and so he told me that he has studied Menno Simons very carefully,
Huh.
and that a lot of people misunderstand when Menno Simons talks about the church as the pure bride of Christ. They assume that he is just giving this unqualified kind of pure body view of church, like it needs to be spotless, like a perfectionism, a Christian
Right.
perfectionism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, no, that is not what Menno Simons was doing. If you read Menno Simons carefully, you'll see that what he means by that is an eschatological reality for the church,
Uh,
meaning that it's moving towards that end. It is seeking
right.
after that type of transformation and that type of existence that's aspiring and hoping for that. But that
Mm-hmm.
in its current form, the church actually needs, and the phrase he used is penitence, an ongoing posture of penitence, which is really a sense of humility,
Mm-hmm.
of receptivity for God's love and grace each day to bring
Mm-hmm.
renewal. Because he said, we can sometimes get off track, and like you don't necessarily have to frame it in terms of like the the self-flagellation of talking about like the depravity and sin
Mm-hmm.
in the
Mm-hmm.
ways of intense guilt, but
Right.
like maybe like through our inattentiveness we've stopped being aware of God's presence, or we may have treated people poorly in our sphere of relationships, or maybe inadvertently participated in the system. We're talking earlier about like inequitable distribution of power. We may have participated in a system that hurts other people's inadvertently, or may not know how to change that. And we need this posture of penitence to go back to God and say, well, forgive us, help us, heal us, like help us to change and receive your grace afresh. And so I thought, oh, that was so helpful. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it also speaks life into that conversation about Christ-centered faith. Like it's relational, it's humble, it's focused on Jesus. And so it was great to have this conversation with him. He's writing a paper right now about this topic of penitence. And so I'm hoping to read that paper. And I
Yeah.
think he's thinking that hopefully this will be a helpful contribution to where the church is in general right now. And kind of navigating this time of, as we said earlier, change and transition, that we also adopt this posture of penitence. So I thought that was really meaningful, and I wanted to share that. And then finally, as is typical, a highlight for me is being with my fellow pastors and
Oh, yeah.
seeing uh, the group together at the end here for our group photo. And this is our partnership of local
Right.
churches that includes Crown Hill Mennonite Church and Orville Mennonite Church and Akron Swahili Mennonite Church and
Mm-hmm.
Oak Grove Mennonite Church and Worcester Mennonite Church. And at times it's included others. We've had partnership from, oh yes, Salem Mennonite Church on back
Mm-hmm.
Orville Road, and at times Martin's Mennonite Church. And so anyway, it's neat in this conference just to get together as a group and take a group photo and connect. And so that's what we did towards the end of the conference. And here's one more photo just with the pastors from Akron, Swahili Mennonite, and David Hargrave from Salem on back Orville
Oh,
Road.
right.
But it was just a
Mm.
real joy to have this time and to know that we go back from the conference also connected in this way too, to partner together and work together. And that partnership applies too beyond this group, also to our other churches in Ohio Conference, that we can partner with them as well. It was a nice note to end on for me, this sense of partnership together. So are there any other thoughts or questions that you have that you'd like to share?
Yeah, just help me to. Yeah, I've never had the chance to be at a conference. For the age I was when I was in America, and then now just being away. But it was always interesting to hear when my dad would report back from what he had heard and experienced, and it always seemed like such an interesting kind of event that would take place. And um, I like what you say at the end, how um, kind of how we've talked about today, in general as well, how it was a real meaningful way for learning, but then also to connect with the other churches in the state and or in the conference, and yeah, and then to bounce ideas off of one another, and then to take what you learned and what stood out to you most, and take it back to your church, and nourish each church individually in that way, and of course the 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 meaning for the conferences is to bring about some momentum. And yeah, this one especially, hopefully, that's what really comes from it is hoping for each church to refocus and get themselves get that momentum back, and reach out again to the new generations of people who maybe didn't think that maybe church was for them, or the new that or for all people, whatever age they may be, whoever they may be. And um yeah, and what a neat thing that what a neat experience that you could have had. And did you feel that this one, what did it, of all of the 14 conferences that you've been to so far, did you feel like maybe probably year after year you feel like one stands out more than the other, but did you feel like this one really kind of had a more impact, or not impact, but really was um maybe exactly what you needed, or felt more memorable than how you felt afterward with other ones?
Yes, 100%. It was one of the best annual conference assemblies that I've been at in my time, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Mm-hmm.
very encouraging and I really needed it. So I'm grateful that I
Great.
could be there. Yes. And
Yeah.
I'm grateful for all the work that the planners put into it, and the time that people took to travel there to participate in it. My fellow pastors, other delegates, Jim and Kim Hartman. It was wonderful that they were there for this. So I'm incredibly grateful. And thank you too, Barney, for taking time
Mm-hmm.
today to process this experience and be willing to reflect on Megan Good's talks and things like that. That was very meaningful to me as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we also want to thank our audience that you too have taken your time to be present for either the video or to listen by audio. We're grateful for you, and we hope that something from today's podcast episode would be meaningful in your own reflection and understanding and journey. And as always, we look forward to next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.